You're checking the news when a horrifying update breaks in the D4vd case that changes everything investigators thought they knew about Celeste Rivas' disappearance. The discovery came when authorities executed a search warrant at a storage facility located approximately 30 miles from where D4vd had last been seen. Acting on information developed through the investigation, detectives arrived at the climate-controlled storage unit expecting to find evidence related to Celeste's disappearance. What they found instead was far more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. Celeste Rivas' body preserved in a large commercial freezer that had been running continuously since her disappearance months earlier. The condition of the body sent shockwaves through the investigative team. Lead Detective Marcus Thompson, a 20-year veteran of homicide investigations, told reporters that in his entire career he had never encountered a case where a victim's body had been deliberately frozen for an extended period. The freezer was a large chest-style unit, the type typically used by restaurants or hunters, with enough capacity to completely contain an adult body. It had been plugged into the storage unit's electrical outlet and had maintained a temperature well below freezing for what investigators estimated to be several months. The storage unit itself had been rented under a false name using cash payments, making it difficult to trace back to any individual. However, surveillance footage from the storage facility showed a vehicle matching the description of one connected to D4vd entering and exiting the property on multiple occasions. The timestamps of these visits corresponded to periods when D4vd's whereabouts had been unaccounted for during the investigation. Security logs showed that someone had accessed the specific unit at least once per week, presumably to ensure the freezer remained operational. According to rumors spreading through law enforcement circles and eventually leaked to media outlets, the discovery had come after investigators received an anonymous tip about the storage facility. The tip had been specific enough to identify the exact unit number, leading some to speculate that someone with direct knowledge of what D4vd had done had finally decided to come forward. Whether the tipster was an accomplice seeking to avoid prosecution or someone who had discovered the truth and couldn't live with the knowledge remained unclear. The medical examiner's office immediately transported the body to their facility for what would be an extremely complex autopsy. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the chief medical examiner, explained to reporters that examining a body that had been frozen presented unique challenges. The freezing process could preserve some evidence while potentially destroying or altering other crucial forensic markers. Determining time of death, cause of death, and other critical information would require specialized techniques and careful analysis that could take weeks to complete. Investigators were baffled by the decision to freeze the body rather than dispose of it in more conventional ways that might have prevented discovery entirely. The choice to preserve the body in a rented storage unit suggested either panic and poor planning, or some calculated reason for keeping the body accessible rather than permanently disposing of it. The psychology behind the decision raised troubling questions about D4vd's state of mind and potential motivations that investigators were still working to understand. The rental agreement for the storage unit showed that payments had been set up to continue automatically for months in advance, suggesting that whoever placed the body there had been planning for long-term storage rather than temporary concealment. The financial trail associated with the rental payments became another avenue of investigation as detectives worked to definitively connect the storage unit to D4vd, despite the use of false identification. The revelation that Celeste's body had been frozen created unprecedented challenges for forensic investigators tasked with determining exactly what had happened to her and building a prosecutable case against her suspected killer. Forensic pathologists explained that freezing a body was a double-edged sword from an investigative perspective. On one hand, the cold temperatures would have slowed decomposition significantly, potentially preserving DNA evidence, trace materials, and physical injuries that might have degraded in a body left at room temperature. The freezing essentially paused many of the natural processes that destroy evidence over time. This meant that certain types of forensic analysis that would normally be impossible months after death might still yield useful results. However, the freezing process also created serious complications. Ice crystals that form during freezing can damage tissue at the cellular level, making it difficult to determine certain types of injuries or to accurately assess the timeline of when specific trauma occurred. Bruising and other soft tissue injuries could be altered by the freezing and thawing process, potentially obscuring whether injuries were inflicted before or after death. The preservation was imperfect and selective, helping some aspects of the investigation while hindering others. Dr. James Rodriguez, a forensic pathologist consulted by media outlets covering the case, explained that determining cause of death in a frozen body required extremely careful analysis. If Celeste had been strangled, frozen, and then thawed for examination, the pressure marks and tissue damage might look different than they would in a fresh body. If she had been shot or stabbed, the freezing could affect blood patterns and wound characteristics. Every finding would need to be interpreted through the lens of how freezing might have altered what investigators were seeing. The timeline of events became even more complicated to establish with a frozen body. Normally, investigators could use decomposition rates, insect activity, and other biological markers to estimate how long someone had been dead. With a frozen body, those typical indicators were absent or unreliable. Investigators would need to rely more heavily on circumstantial evidence: when Celeste was last seen alive, when the storage unit was rented, when the freezer was purchased, to construct a timeline of events. Toxicology testing faced its own unique challenges with frozen tissue samples. Some drugs and toxins could degrade during the freezing process while others might be well preserved. The medical examiner's office would need to use specialized testing protocols designed for frozen samples, and even then, some results might be inconclusive. If poison or drugs had been involved in Celeste's death, proving it definitively might be more difficult than in a typical case. The condition of Celeste's clothing and any items found with her body became crucial evidence. Freezing would have preserved fabrics, fibers, and trace evidence that might otherwise have been lost. Investigators carefully documented every item before the body was moved, knowing that the frozen state of these materials might provide some of the most reliable forensic evidence available. DNA from a perpetrator, transferred during a struggle or assault, could potentially still be recovered from clothing that had been frozen immediately after the crime. The question of whether the body had been frozen immediately after death, or whether there had been a delay, became critical for investigators. If the body had been at room temperature for hours or days before freezing, that period would have allowed for decomposition and evidence degradation that freezing couldn't reverse. Forensic entomology, the study of insects on remains, might provide some clues if any insect evidence was present from a pre-freezing period, though this was uncertain given the circumstances. And now people found themselves asking an unsettling question. When freezing a body can both preserve crucial evidence and destroy it, does that unpredictability work for or against investigators trying to solve the case? The decision to freeze Celeste's body rather than dispose of it through other means fascinated criminal psychologists and investigators who recognized that this choice revealed important information about the perpetrator's mindset and motivations. Dr. Amanda Chen, a criminal psychologist who had consulted on numerous homicide cases, explained that freezing a victim's body was relatively rare in criminal cases and typically indicated one of several possible psychological states or practical considerations. The first possibility was panic and poor decision-making immediately after the crime. Someone who killed impulsively might freeze the body as a way to delay dealing with disposal while they figured out a permanent solution. The freezer became a holding pattern born of fear and indecision rather than careful planning. However, the rental of a storage unit specifically for this purpose and the setup of automatic payments suggested more premeditation than a panic response would typically involve. This pointed to a second possibility, that the freezing was a calculated decision intended to control the timeline of discovery. By keeping the body frozen and hidden, the perpetrator could delay the investigation, potentially allowing alibis to become harder to verify or challenge as time passed and memories faded. The longer the delay between disappearance and body discovery, the harder it became to establish precise timelines. A third, more disturbing possibility was that the perpetrator wanted to maintain access to the body for psychological reasons. Some killers kept victims' bodies or belongings as trophies or because they couldn't psychologically let go of their victim. The storage unit provided a place where the perpetrator could visit the body if desired, maintaining a connection that served some twisted emotional or psychological need. This possibility, while deeply disturbing, couldn't be ruled out given the effort involved in maintaining the freezer for months. Criminal profilers noted that the level of planning required to rent a storage unit, purchase or acquire a large freezer, transport a body without detection, and maintain electrical payments suggested someone who was organized and methodical. This wasn't an impulsive crime, followed by hasty concealment. The perpetrator had thought through at least some aspects of what they were doing, even if the ultimate plan was flawed or incomplete. This organizational ability made the perpetrator potentially more dangerous and sophisticated than someone who acted purely on impulse. The choice of a storage facility, rather than somewhere more accessible like a personal residence, suggested awareness of the risks involved. Keeping a body in one's home created constant risk of discovery by family members, neighbors, or anyone who might have legitimate reason to enter the property. A storage unit provided distance and separation, reducing the daily risk while still maintaining access. The criminal thinking revealed by this choice indicated someone trying to balance conflicting needs, hiding the evidence while keeping it available. The maintenance of the freezer over months showed unusual dedication to preserving the body. Most perpetrators wanted to dispose of evidence as quickly and permanently as possible. The ongoing commitment to keeping the freezer running, checking on it regularly, and maintaining rental payments revealed someone who felt compelled to continue this arrangement rather than simply abandoning it or finding a permanent disposal method. The psychology behind this sustained effort was puzzling and concerning to investigators. Some profilers speculated that the perpetrator might have intended to eventually move or dispose of the body, but had been unable to do so due to increased police attention or other factors that made the risk too high. The storage unit might have started as temporary storage that became long-term due to circumstances beyond the perpetrator's control. This would explain why the body was still in the freezer months later rather than having been disposed of permanently. The emotional coldness required to visit a storage unit containing a frozen body, to check that the freezer was running properly, to maintain this secret over months. These actions required a level of psychological detachment that troubled everyone involved in the investigation. Whether this detachment was inherent to the perpetrator's personality or was developed as a coping mechanism after the crime, it indicated someone capable of sustained deception and emotional compartmentalization. And people considering this disturbing behavior pattern found themselves wondering, when someone goes to such lengths to preserve and hide a body rather than permanently disposing of it, what does that reveal about whether the killing was planned or impulsive? The discovery of Celeste's frozen body created significant obstacles for the medical examiner's office in determining the exact cause and manner of death, challenges that could impact the strength of the prosecution's case. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the chief medical examiner, held a press conference to explain the complexities involved in examining a body that had been frozen for an extended period. She emphasized that while frozen bodies could preserve some evidence, they also created unique interpretative challenges that required careful, methodical analysis. The autopsy would need to be conducted in stages, allowing the body to thaw slowly and naturally to minimize additional damage to tissues that might contain crucial evidence. The determination of cause of death, whether Celeste had been strangled, shot, stabbed, poisoned, or killed through some other means, would require examination of various body systems and tissues that might have been altered by the freezing process. Strangulation marks on the neck, for example, might appear different after freezing and thawing than they would in a fresh body. The medical examiner would need to account for these changes when interpreting findings and would likely need to consult with experts who had experience with frozen remains. Time of death estimation, typically a crucial element in homicide investigations, would be nearly impossible to determine with precision in this case. Normally, forensic pathologists used body temperature, rigor mortis, liver mortis, and decomposition rates to estimate when death occurred. With a frozen body, all of these indicators were either absent or completely unreliable. Investigators would need to rely on circumstantial evidence: when Celeste was last seen alive, when the freezer was purchased, when the storage unit was rented, to bracket the possible time of death. The manner of death determination, homicide, suicide, accident, or natural causes, would depend on findings from the autopsy and the investigation's context. While the circumstances of finding the body in a rented storage unit made homicide the obvious conclusion, the medical examiner still needed physical evidence to support that determination officially. Defense attorneys would certainly challenge any conclusions that relied heavily on circumstantial context rather than definitive physical findings from the body itself. Trace evidence analysis offered some hope for investigators. Hair, fibers, and other materials that might have been transferred to Celeste's body or clothing during an assault would likely be well preserved by freezing. The medical examiner's team carefully collected these materials during the examination, knowing they might provide some of the most reliable forensic evidence available. DNA from a perpetrator, if present on the body or clothing, would have been protected from degradation by the cold temperatures. Sexual assault evidence, if relevant to the case, would be collected and analyzed using specialized protocols for frozen samples. The freezing might have preserved biological materials that would normally degrade quickly, potentially allowing investigators to establish whether sexual assault had occurred even months after death. However, the interpretation of these findings would need to account for possible alterations caused by the freezing process. The examination of injuries and wound patterns required extensive photographic documentation at each stage as the body thawed. Wounds that might have been obscured or altered by ice crystal formation might become clearer as tissues returned to a more natural state. The medical examiner's team worked methodically, documenting changes throughout the thawing process to ensure no evidence was lost or overlooked due to the unusual preservation method. Toxicology results, when they eventually became available, would need to be interpreted cautiously. Some drugs and toxins remained stable during freezing, while others could degrade or become harder to detect. The toxicology laboratory would need to use specialized extraction and testing methods designed for frozen tissue samples. Any positive findings would be scrutinized carefully to ensure they represented substances present at the time of death rather than artifacts of the preservation process. The medical examiner acknowledged that the final report might include more uncertainties and qualifications than would typically be present in a homicide autopsy. The frozen state of the body simply made some determinations impossible, or less certain than investigators would prefer. However, Dr. Mitchell emphasized that despite these challenges, the examination would provide crucial information about what happened to Celeste and would support the criminal prosecution of whoever was responsible for her death. And observers following the case began to consider minors. If the frozen state of a body makes it harder to prove exactly how someone died, does that create reasonable doubt that could affect a jury's verdict? As investigators worked to connect D4vd definitively to the storage unit and the frozen body, they uncovered evidence of his access to freezers and his movements that aligned with maintaining the macabre storage arrangement. Financial records showed that D4vd had purchased a large commercial chest freezer from a restaurant supply company 3 days after Celeste was last seen alive. The purchase had been made with cash, and D4vd had rented a truck to transport the freezer from the store. Surveillance footage from the supply company showed D4vd loading the freezer into the truck with timestamps that investigators carefully documented. The timing of this purchase, so close to Celeste's disappearance, was highly suspicious and suggested premeditation or quick action after her death. The truck rental records showed that D4vd had kept the vehicle for 2 days, more than enough time to transport the freezer to the storage unit and to move other items if necessary. GPS data from the rental truck obtained through a warrant showed that the vehicle had traveled to the area where the storage facility was located during the rental period. While the GPS wasn't precise enough to definitively place the truck at the specific facility, the general area match was significant circumstantial evidence. Investigators interviewed employees at the storage facility who remembered seeing someone matching D4vd's description during the initial rental process, though the person had used a false name and paid in cash. The facility's security camera footage from the rental date was of poor quality, but forensic video analysts were working to enhance images of the person's face and gait for comparison with known images of D4vd. Even if the facial features remained unclear, the way someone walked and moved could be distinctive enough for identification purposes. Electricity bills for the storage unit showed consistent power usage patterns over months, indicating that a large appliance had been running continuously. The power consumption matched what would be expected from a commercial chest freezer operating constantly. The reliability of these payments suggested whoever set up the arrangement wanted to ensure the freezer never lost power, which would have resulted in decomposition and potentially evidence discovery through odor. Cell phone tower data placed D4vd's phone in the vicinity of the storage facility on multiple occasions, including weekly visits that appeared regular enough to suggest a maintenance schedule. The pattern of visits, minus typically during late evening hours when the facility would have fewer other customers present, indicated someone trying to minimize the chance of being observed or remembered. The consistency of these visits over weeks and months showed sustained commitment to whatever was being stored in that unit. Investigators also discovered that D4vd had researched freezers and body preservation online in the days immediately following Celeste's disappearance. Search history recovered from his devices included queries about how long frozen bodies could be preserved, whether freezing affected forensic evidence, and what size freezer would be needed for a person. The digital trail was damning evidence of consciousness of guilt and planning, showing that D4vd had been thinking about these specific issues at the exact time when Celeste went missing. Interviews with D4vd's associates revealed that some had noticed behavioral changes and unusual activities around the time of Celeste's disappearance. One acquaintance mentioned that D4vd had suddenly needed to use a truck and had been vague about what he was transporting. Another noted that D4vd had seemed stressed and had made cryptic comments about having to deal with a problem. While these observations were subjective and open to interpretation, they contributed to a pattern that investigators found compelling. The storage facility's visitor logs, though incomplete due to the cash-based nature of many transactions, showed entries around the times that D4vd's phone had been in the area. Cross-referencing the various data sources, phone locations, vehicle rentals, facility logs, surveillance footage, created a web of evidence that, while largely circumstantial when considered individually, formed a powerful narrative when examined collectively. Defense attorneys would certainly challenge the evidence connecting D4vd to the storage unit, arguing that cell phone tower data wasn't precise enough to definitively place him at the specific location, and that surveillance footage was too poor quality for positive identification. However, prosecutors felt confident that the totality of evidence, the freezer purchase, the truck rental, the phone locations, the online searches, the timing of everything, created a compelling case that D4vd had access to and control over the storage unit where Celeste's body was found. The news that Celeste's body had been found frozen in a storage unit devastated her family, and shocked a community that had been hoping for a different outcome, however unlikely that hope had become over the months since her disappearance. Celeste's mother, Maria Rivas, spoke to reporters through tears outside the family's home. She described the horror of learning not just that her daughter was dead, but that her body had been frozen and stored like an object rather than treated with any dignity or humanity. The additional layer of violation beyond the murder itself, the desecration of keeping Celeste's body in a freezer for months, added a dimension of suffering that Maria struggled to put into words. The confirmation of death ended one kind of agonizing uncertainty while replacing it with new nightmares about what her daughter had endured. The family's victim advocate explained that learning these disturbing details about what had happened to Celeste's remains created additional trauma layered on top of the grief of her loss. Families of murder victims often struggled with intrusive thoughts about their loved ones' final moments and the circumstances of their death. In this case, knowing that Celeste's body had been frozen and stored added a macabre element that would haunt the family forever. No amount of justice could undo the knowledge of how Celeste had been treated after death. Community vigils were held in Celeste's memory, with hundreds of people gathering to honor her life and to support her grieving family. The vigils took on a somber tone as participants processed not just the confirmation of Celeste's death, but the disturbing circumstances of how her body had been concealed. Speakers at the vigils emphasized Celeste's life, her personality, and her potential rather than dwelling on the horrible details of her death. But the knowledge of those details permeated the gatherings, whether spoken about directly or not. Social media erupted with expressions of grief, rage, and demands for justice. The hashtag Remembering Celeste trended as people shared memories, photos, and tributes. However, the posts also reflected the horror people felt at learning how her body had been found. Comments ranged from expressions of sympathy for the family to angry demands that whoever was responsible face maximum punishment. The collective processing of both Celeste's death and the disturbing circumstances of her body's concealment played out across multiple platforms. The school Celeste had attended held memorial services and provided counseling resources for students and staff struggling with the news. Teachers and counselors noted that students were particularly affected by the details about the frozen body, finding that specific details somehow more horrifying than the simple fact of death. The developmental stage of adolescence made processing death difficult under any circumstances, but the macabre elements of this case created additional challenges for helping young people cope with the tragedy. Advocacy organizations focused on missing persons and victims' rights used Celeste's case to highlight the need for resources to support families dealing with the loss of loved ones to violence. The Rivas family's experience, the months of uncertainty during the search, the devastating confirmation of death, the ongoing trauma of trial preparations, illustrated the long-term support needs that victim families had. Organizations called for better funding for victim services and for systemic changes to how the criminal justice system treated families of murder victims. The discovery of Celeste's body also reignited discussions about violence against women and the importance of communities taking missing persons cases seriously from the very beginning. Some advocates argued that if the investigation had moved more quickly, or if certain evidence had been prioritized earlier, Celeste's body might have been found sooner. While these criticisms were debatable, they reflected frustration that even when everything possible was done, it still took months to bring Celeste home to her family. Religious leaders in the community offered spiritual comfort to the Rivas family while acknowledging that faith provided only partial solace in the face of such tragedy. The family's priest spoke about the importance of finding meaning in suffering, while not minimizing the real horror of what had happened. The religious community rallied around the family with practical support, meals, childcare for Celeste's siblings, help with expenses, while recognizing that no amount of support could truly ease their pain. And people watching this family's anguish found themselves reflecting on a painful reality. When someone you love becomes a victim of violence, the details of what happened to them can create a secondary trauma that compounds the grief of their loss in ways that never fully heal. The discovery of Celeste's frozen body represented a major breakthrough in the case that would allow prosecutors to move forward with upgraded charges and potentially a murder trial that had been impossible while she remained missing. Legal experts explained that the difference between prosecuting a disappearance case and prosecuting a murder case with a body was substantial. While no body murder prosecutions did occur and sometimes resulted in convictions, they were significantly more difficult because defense attorneys could always argue that the missing person was still alive somewhere. Finding Celeste's body eliminated that defense strategy and allowed prosecutors to charge murder rather than just kidnapping or other crimes related to her disappearance. The district attorney's office announced that they would be seeking upgraded charges against D4vd to include first-degree murder. The evidence of the freezer purchase, the storage unit rental, and the online searches about preserving bodies suggested premeditation, which was an element required for first-degree murder charges in their jurisdiction. The prosecutors believed they could demonstrate that D4vd had planned Celeste's murder in advance, or at minimum had planned how to conceal her death immediately after it occurred, either of which would support the highest level of homicide charges. Defense attorneys would face significant challenges in mounting a defense against the upgraded charges. The circumstantial evidence connecting D4vd to the storage unit and the freezer was substantial, and the frozen preservation of the body might actually help the prosecution by maintaining forensic evidence that would have been lost if the body had been disposed of differently. While the defense would certainly challenge each piece of evidence and argue about reasonable doubt, the totality of evidence created a compelling narrative that would be difficult to overcome. The trial timeline was uncertain, with estimates ranging from 6 months to over a year before the case would actually reach a jury. The medical examiner's office needed time to complete their complex analysis of the frozen remains. Prosecutors needed to organize their evidence and prepare their witnesses. Defense attorneys needed time to investigate and develop their strategy. The complexity of the forensic issues involved would require extensive expert testimony from both sides, adding to the length and complexity of the eventual trial. Victim advocates working with the Rivas family prepared them for the long road ahead. The trial would require them to attend court proceedings where disturbing evidence about Celeste's death would be presented. They would need to provide victim impact statements and possibly testify about Celeste's life and the impact of her loss. The process would force them to repeatedly relive the trauma of her death, while hoping that the outcome would be justice and accountability for whoever took her from them. The community's attention would remain focused on the case through the trial and beyond. Celeste had become a symbol of young lives cut short by violence, and her case had sparked broader conversations about safety, justice, and the importance of taking missing persons reports seriously. Whatever the ultimate outcome of the legal proceedings, Celeste's story would continue to resonate and to serve as a reminder of the human cost of violence. For investigators who had spent months searching for Celeste and trying to determine what had happened to her, the discovery of her body brought a mixture of emotions. Relief that they could finally give her family answers and move forward with prosecution was tempered by the grim reality of having their worst fears confirmed. The unusual circumstances of finding her frozen in a storage unit would make this case memorable throughout their careers, though not in ways anyone would choose to be remembered. The case stood as a stark reminder that people capable of violence were sometimes also capable of disturbing acts of concealment that revealed a coldness and calculation that went beyond the violence itself. The decision to freeze and store Celeste's body, to maintain that arrangement for months, to visit the storage unit regularly, these actions painted a picture of someone whose capacity for deception and compartmentalization was as disturbing as the violence that had ended Celeste's life. As the legal system moved forward with prosecution and the community continued processing this tragedy, one final question lingered in everyone's minds. When justice is finally possible after months of uncertainty, can it ever truly be enough to balance the scales against a loss so profound and circumstances so disturbing?